Police often highlight the items they take when arresting people in drug busts. One viewer asked, reporting on a recent large drug trafficking bust made me wonder what happens to the drugs, money, and firearms confiscated during these operations. Here's Victor Puente with the answer to that good question.
Like most states in the U.S., Kentucky allows law enforcement to take property they suspect of being connected to illegal activity, even if someone isn't convicted of a crime. It also lays out how that property should be disposed of. Controlled substances, quote, shall be ordered destroyed by the order of the trial court unless there is a legal use for them, in which case they may be sold to a proper buyer as determined by the Cabinet for Health and Family Services by the regulations there. When property other than controlled substances is forfeited and not retained for official use, which police are allowed to do, it may be sold for its cash value. That includes items like cars and electronics. Coin, currency, or the proceeds from the sale of properly forfeited items shall be distributed as followed. 85% will go to the law enforcement agency or agencies which seized that property. 15% will go to the Office of the Attorney General, or in the alternative, the 15% will go to the Prosecutor's Advisory Council to deposit on behalf of the Commonwealth's attorney or county attorney who participated in the forfeiture proceeding. Confiscated firearms are sent to state police to either be destroyed or auctioned off to federally licensed firearm dealers, with the funds used for police activities and equipment. Now, critics of civil forfeiture say that process can lead to innocent people having their property taken. The nonprofit Institute for Justice, which opposes civil forfeiture, gives Kentucky a D- ranking for its civil forfeiture laws. They're pushing for states to move to criminal forfeiture, where property is only taken if someone is convicted of a crime. If you have a good question, just email us, goodquestion@wkyt.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.